Local historian and fiction writer Allan Levine has just produced another book titled Seeking the Fabled City. The book will receive its launch on October 30th. On Tuesday, October 9th, I had the opportunity to interview Allan. The interview took place in the reading room of the Kaufman Silverberg Library of the Asper Jewish Community Campus. The interview begins with Allan explaining where the name Seeking the Fabled City came from.
That the line is in the last stanza of this poem that Klein, who was a famous Jewish poet, although many people don't know who he is today, and he was also editor of the Canadian Jewish Chronicle for about 20 years, from the 30s to the 50s, and in this poem, autobiographical 1942 that he wrote about the immigrant experience, he has the line in the last part about Jews seeking the fabled city.
You quote the poem in your book, don't you?
Yes. Yeah, that's where the name came from, and that's I was looking for something interesting.
Yeah. So how many years in the writing is this?
I'd say this was about a 2.5-year project from start to finish, maybe a little bit more.
And when was Coming of Age, a history of Jews?
2009.
2009.
2009 it was published.
Yeah.
And so this was like 9 years later, and as I think I told you, the idea for this book actually came from the publisher rather than me. They thought a popular written book on Canadian Jewish experience and history would be a good idea, and I guess you could say they recruited me to do the job. And I mean, I had to then say, they sort of said to me, what will this book look like? So I had to structure it based on my own research, and they were fine with
And
that.
you divided the book into 4 parts.
Right, I divided it into 4 parts, somewhat based on the earliest experience of Jews coming to pre-Confederation Canada, a very tiny amount. And I mean, I think by 1830, there was probably only 100 and something Jews in what would be called Canada, mainly living in Montreal and what would become Toronto. Some in St. John, New Brunswick, a few other, but very tiny number, and therefore most of them were German or English mainly. They were merchants. I would say there were Jewish fur traders I found kind of interesting, who went into the bush and had all sorts of adventures, some of them dangerous, and did not always get along.
Took non-Jewish spouses.
A lot of them took non-Jewish spouses, that's true.
Yeah.
But some of them also were behind the founding of the first synagogues in Montreal, the first synagogue in Montreal, Shirith Israel, or the Spanish or Portuguese synagogue, which still exists to this day, which is the...
Well, if I can touch on 3 of the themes, I think the most prevalent theme is anti-Semitism.
Yeah, well, that's what I say. Sort of, the book, like Coming of Age, I suppose, the book has 2 interrelated parts. One is the way in which people build a community, and how that you go about that in a land that's not always friendly. And so there's a lot of internal bickering and feuding and internal politics, and a lot of money needed to build up this structure of the community the way it is today, which is frankly a rather remarkable story, especially say somewhere in Winnipeg, which has an amazingly diverse community, and it's such a small community really, number-wise. And the other interrelated part of that is sort of in this story, what I call sort of how Canada became tolerant, or somewhat, and that's really the story of how anti-Semitism affected Jewish lives, because, as I say, for a good 30, 40 years of the 250 that I look at, maybe 220 years, anti-Semitism was prevalent, but more so after 1880. Before that, there was anti-Jewish sentiment, of course, but the numbers were low, so Jews were less visible, and also the German and English Jews sort of melded in with the community. It's when you get this sort of the anti-Semitism meshed with an anti-immigrant or anti-poverty kind of view in Canada that Jews became much more visible when all these Russian Eastern Europeans started coming in, 1880s, 90s, 1890s, and the turn of the century. So that gave the whole thing of visibility. I mean, the majority in Canada hated detested the Irish poverty immigrant, the Irish poor who came after the famine in the 1840s, and in Toronto they were treated abysmally. But so there was just a general fear of immigrants who were going to ruin cities and civilization as the majority knew it. But then you also got these non-Christians coming, along with Italian, Slavs, and a whole host of Asians were even hated more than Jews were, that's for sure. And so the story is, how do these people persevere alongside anti-Semitism in all its various forms? I think one of the things that I think for me stands out in the book, a couple things. One is that from the majority point of view, they never really regarded themselves as anti-Semitic. I mean, they didn't see Canada as being unfriendly or intolerable, when in fact, from our perspective, they clearly were. In the 30s, they made this distinction between, let's say, Adrian Arcand, who had a fascist Nazi-like party in Quebec, and other fascist groups across Canada, and any violence. So for them, violence against immigrants or Jews was one thing, but restricting them in universities or not allowing them to join social clubs or having property covenants in summer resorts, that was entirely acceptable and not really regarded as racist. And yet it was. So the distinction is, I say,
it's interesting,
kind of
especially
silly.
when you start touching on the quota system. Here we're familiar with what happened at the University of Manitoba Medical School, but you talk about McGill too.
All right, McGill, U of T. I mean, almost every university, especially in Montreal. Well, again, the book is framed around mainly Montreal, Toronto, and Winnipeg, because for until, let's say, the 1960s or even more, 75 to 80% of all Jews in Canada lived in those three cities, and most of them, frankly, lived in Montreal and Toronto. I mean, even today, something like 70% probably, I would bet, of all Jews live in those two cities, especially Toronto, which probably has more than half the Jewish population. So that there's one, but also the reaction of the Jewish community is also interesting, because it was never, there was for years a never make wave kind of attitude. You didn't want to draw too much attention to yourself, and when, let's say in the 30s, when there was a much more vocal protesting about German Jewish refugees trying to get into the country, even that was pretty mute compared to what it might have been, because the truth was, well, Jews over the years into the 1950s and 60s had some economic power. Their political power was rather limited. This idea that Jews had power. I mean, they were being more successful. The immigrants' children eventually became professionals and doctors and lawyers, and eventually those barriers, the discriminatory barriers, were broken. But political power was fleeting. I mean, there are examples, and that I have in the book, of people breaking that mold. Louis Rasminski becoming the first Jewish governor of the Bank of Canada is frankly an amazing.
But after a long time.
Yes, and he was involved. But it's still amazing
that
in 1961 Diefenbaker appointed him. I think that's one. And judges, Borlaug.
It's interesting how conservative prime ministers Diefenbaker and Harper and Mulroney were all willing to go against the flow.
Right, and Leslie Frost, who is also
in Ontario.
The Ontario Premier, was very big on breaking down discrimination.
Do you ascribe this to the individual personalities of those leaders?
I make the point. I would make the point. In general, when laws change in Canada, there's generally an attitudinal change first, and that politicians are slow to follow, and then ultimately laws change. It's not in all respects, but if you think about how marijuana has finally become legalized, think how long that process has been, or attitudes about gay rights or women voting or something like that. But with discrimination and tolerance, it was actually government going further than their base, let's say, the people who supported them wanted to do. And I found this great letter between Leslie Frost when he started bringing in anti-discrimination legislation. Perhaps I suspect he was influenced by what happened in the Holocaust, as well as the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the world was changing, so he was aware of that. And I also found some research about lobbying by ethnic groups that he actually listened to. So he was influenced by that, but his supporters did not approve of that. So when they got rid of property covenants, that you could not keep Jews from buying or owning land at summer resorts, some of his supporters wrote him, and this judge wrote him and told him he just didn't want Negroes or Jews.
How did you get a hold of that letter from the judge?
I actually found it.
It's amazing.
Well, yeah, no, it was actually deep inside a huge biography of Leslie Frost.
Oh.
So I just happened to come across it.
But let's turn to some of the other things. You have, aside from the earliest days, which is interesting.
Yes.
And then you get into sort of the anti-Semitism. Then you talk about Israel.
Right.
And how important it is. And finally, well, I would talk about the political organizations,
Yes.
which I still have trouble wrapping my head around. The various incarnations of
Right.
of
Well, it's really, again, one of the themes, I hate to say it, is that money talks in the Jewish community, for better or worse. You wouldn't have the community campus here if it wasn't for a select group of people and being generous, and that has been the story of the Jewish community from 1880s onward. No synagogues, and all these institutions are expensive. As you know, it's very expensive to be Jewish, and so that has been a theme throughout, and in every single city, people have come forward who have been successful and wealthy, men mainly, in the early years, or a good portion of the 20th century, and they've called the shots, and what they have is what I call the Macher gene, in that they want to, not only their money, they want influence and prestige, and that has, of course, created, perhaps in some situations, an undemocratic environment when small groups of people are calling shots. So, depending that story of the creation of CIJA and the end of the Canadian Jewish Congress, it's very volatile. I interviewed some of the key people, and you get two different stories,
yeah.
and it's hard to know. I mean, I personally, the people giving the money to the federations ultimately did not see the value in what the Canadian Jewish Congress was doing, particularly when it came to Israel, at a time when Israel, they believed, was under siege from around the world, and Israeli apartheid days and all sorts of things like that, and thus that led to the creation of organizations. But there's only so much money, and thus the Congress lost its.
I got to tell you, I interviewed Shimon Fogel only
yes,
once,
I have too.
and I asked him about whether CIJA really was inclusive of all Jewish, and he said, of course it is. And I said, what about Yujpo? And he said, what's Yujpo?
Yeah.
You have quite a bit about Yujpo.
Yeah, well, it's, again, some things are made, that's a small group of people, again, with limited political influence in the larger community. They've always been, I would say, not on the fringe, but I mean, for a time, that left-wing secular Jewish culture of the Parrot School variety was quite popular in places like Winnipeg and even in Toronto, despite mainstream rabbis denouncing them as, the Parrot Schools were denounced as godless institutions, and through the fact that many Jews were in the garment industry and were fighting Jewish bosses and owners, and so you had, into the 40s at least, a pretty strong group of people, but even they had lots of infighting amongst themselves classically. So that's why you had various varieties of schools breaking up, and in Montreal the Parrot School split in two for 25 years because they always argued about how much Hebrew to have versus Yiddish and things like that.
Yeah.
But that group of people, Yujpo is just, it's seen in a mythical kind of a nostalgia way by some of its proponents today, and they still write books about it and how important it was. But it's, to me, it's a small group of people. It's sort of like what I somewhat regard the agricultural settlements. They are very, and I've written about this before too.
Rose-colored glasses.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great story, but it's really not quite representative of how Jews were living. Most Jews. I mean, so from this kind of a book, I try to take a larger historical.
By the way, when you talk about Baron de Hirsch,
yes,
you said he allocated $36 million towards the resettlement.
But that was not just in Canada; it was Australia.
But how much would that be worth
Oh,
what,
100
close to
million?
$1 billion now?
I have to look, but yeah, good. Well, he was a very wealthy guy. You know, there was a world once without income tax. So these people got very rich, and their money, they had lots of money they could spend. And, yeah, so you know that those agricultural settlements are interesting, and people tell, and they're of course important. But we're talking about a tiny group of people.
Well, the other thing that some of the figures that you have about the migration, how many, was it 15,000 Jews came in the 1930s? It was a very small figure.
Yes.
Were allowed in.
Yeah, well, you mean after
After
like
1931.
right, yeah, there was not a lot. I mean, some.
Which we know. But what I was surprised at is actually how few Holocaust survivors came. You have 36,000, I think.
For Canada as a
For
whole,
Canada.
I'd have to check.
And the United States took over 250,000.
Yeah, well, it's a large.
Well, I know proportionally, but it was still
Well, it was difficult for them to get in. I mean,
Yeah.
I remember interviewing Mr. Philip Wise, a friend, and how difficult his process was, and he had to say he could sew buttons when, and ridiculous experience of having to pay back the government for the transportation. I mean, they didn't listen. In 1946, most Canadians in a famous Gallup poll did not want.
Oh, the
Jews
hatred of Jews was.
coming.
I've seen that
Again, because they're poor, they're going to take. The Jews are all these kind of stereotypes.
But the Holocaust did not elicit any sympathy.
No, not initially.
No.
I mean, again, that takes a long time, and I mean, it wasn't until I would say the Eichmann trial that people started talking.
And the Six-Day
publicly.
War.
Yes,
yeah.
that people were more conscious. Even in Israel, you didn't talk.
But
about
much less sympathy in Canada for Jews in Israel than in the United States.
But again, the Holocaust survivors themselves didn't talk about it. They were embarrassed. They were not. The Jews living here didn't ask about it. Some of them didn't believe their stories. So that contributed to the fact they lived in. They kept to themselves and didn't really talk about it. It wasn't something. Listen, the world changes, and the attitude about the Holocaust. Nobody wrote books about it or wrote about it. I think in one of my other earlier researchers, I was amazed that the Library of Congress classification for the Holocaust was not created until the late 60s, which strikes me. Yeah, I mean, until early 60s, there were just no books, or you couldn't even get books published. And today, it's
the largest single subject, I think, on Google.
Exactly.
Let's close. I want to ask you, because you don't offer much in the way of prediction for the future, but you do describe the assimilation trend.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's the old intermarriage rates are pretty high in Canada. People are not joining synagogues to the same extent. Will the Jewish Post news exist, and will people actually read something, a community newspaper like that in 20 years? I don't know. The answers
they read
are not
any newspapers.
Yeah, exactly. So the people I talk to, especially rabbis, have great faith. And honestly, in a city like Toronto, I can't, even though it's so big and the Orthodox community is so large, I can't see anything bad happening there. It's smaller places, like in Atlantic, Canada. I talked to some head of the federation there, or the former head, and he says that it's very tiny in all the maritime provinces. And their children, the parents might be involved, but the children get married, usually intermarry, and that's it. They don't count anymore, and they don't. And that is a lot of parts of Canada. Victoria has a high intermarriage rate. So, I think you certainly can't go by the number of people
so does
who are members of
Vancouver,
synagogue.
but interestingly, you point this out, as I have read elsewhere.
Yes.
Vancouver's Jewish schools are the only ones that are thriving.
Yes, I don't know why that is, and they're very expensive.
Yeah, very expensive.
Yeah, you have Jonathan Leipzig, or was head of one of them.
Apparently, they have one principal there of their big Jewish day school who's a real dynamo.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, it just could be all sorts of local factors, and But I was amazed that the tuition it rivals Toronto. I mean,
It was about 20
but
something thousand.
$14,000 it was at one of the places where at the time the figures that I read.
Oh, that's for the elementary.
Yeah, 24.
But
yeah,
Toronto's high schools.
Toronto because the government there, the Ontario government doesn't
it
support
refuses.
supporting